Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Vimo, and I work in Saldru and in Acer, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. So we've got lots of very distinguished speakers and a really interesting and exciting lineup. The event today is about structured engagement on African inequalities. And we're bringing in two pieces of work. One was a book which we in Acer co-authored with the French Development Agency. I'm going to try and say it once and once only. The Agence Française de Développement, something like that, which we released late last year. And the second substantive work, which is not ours but is being discussed by Andrew, who I'll introduce in a little bit, is from the World Bank, which was also a big piece of work called Leveling the Playing Field in Africa. And that was a report on African inequalities. And so these are the two kind of substantive pieces that we're going to present, but then there's a lot of work going to be done between the panelists and the presenters on kind of unpacking this and thinking about it, and then kind of the end point is about how do we try to address and deal with these inequalities, right? So that's about as much as I'm going to say. The first presenter, just to welcome us, we have two people. Professor Lebrant from Acer, who's the head of Acer and is a professor in the School of Economics and in Saldru. Marie?
No, you're not expected to clap. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the African Centre of Excellence for Inequality Research. And it's my extraordinary privilege, actually, to welcome you all to this side event on African inequality. When ASA was established as Arua's first Centre of Research Excellence, that was in May 2018. And the inception workshop was just upstairs. And we were the first out of the blocks of all of the Arua Centers of Excellence. And when we look at the photographs, a little bit yellowy now and all of that, from that event, it shows the General Secretary of Arua, that's Professor Ernest Arrietty, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, members of our core nodes from South Africa, Ghana, and Kenya, and under David in the photograph. So from the outset, when we set off on our path, it was a partnership with the AFD. And indeed, the very reason that we were the first out of the blocks was because we had this partnership with AFD and the EU Inequality Facility that allowed us to get going with our work while Arua was still sorting out its story. A very committed group. And the book we're putting on the table today as our contribution into this event is a consolidation of a very intensive and impactful setup phase since then for all of us. With our shared commitment to analyzing African inequalities in order to support actions to overcome them, we've built strong cross-country center, cross-continental networks, done good impactful research, including especially working very intensively with the policy researchers that sit in the middle of government departments and in the middle of national statistical agencies, trying to do their job as well as they can and finding common cause with them in this working partnership. And we're using that then as a platform for national and continental discussions and policy dialogues. It's been a wonderful privilege to be part of that. We've produced some reliable data, written up inequality diagnostics, forged this methodology in a sense for countries to take stock, like the poverty reports that are produced everywhere. To take stock of their national inequality situation, collate it, and work out where they are. The way that's gone about, we've gone about our work in partnership with national statistical offices in particular, has enjoyed extraordinary resonance. And so, besides the three countries that are the core partners of ASA, a number of these other diagnostics have been produced on demand, and we're very proud of that because it's a sign of meeting a need, if you like. And these reports then become national statistical releases of two of the three countries, and others now subsequent across our continent, and AFD have taken this much more broadly as well. Other policy tools that we've developed with indigenous capacity, that's the key point as well. To take forward these tools and use them in the budget process, not just use them as a piece of analysis at a particular point in time. That's also been great to be part of. So that brings us back then to today. And, there's no inconsistency between that desire to actually get down and do the hard work and sweat the detail with partners that care and academic excellence. They align completely. If you're going to take yourself seriously enough to want to be shaping the options and to want to be contributing to that, well, you better be doing your job as an academic group anyway. You better be doing your job at the world standard. Otherwise, what are you saying to your continent? So it's an extraordinary partnership, the most wonderful privilege. I thank AFD and the EU. And of course, as is evident from today's meeting, there's many who are committed to this cause. And I think the meeting reflects that today. And thank you all for being here. And as a sign, as sort of a benchmark as we redouble our efforts together. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Murray. Next up, we have Carl Bernadette, who's the Executive Director for Innovation Strategy and Research of the AFD.
Thank you, Vimal. I'm really glad to be here. First, I've been promoted. And second, I'm really delighted to be here with you for this event. And thank you for your word, Murray. And it's really a personal appreciation to be here for this important discussion. But I would like to build upon the word you mentioned: partnership, dialogue, policy dialogue, excellence. And this is what we look for partnership when we do research in a development bank. So, and maybe another more personal word. We are in a complex time in terms of policy dialogues. Okay, I see you smiling, so you're following me. Okay. I mean, it's not even. It's beyond debate. It's the philosophy of action that is questioned, and the vision of our society, and how do we want to frame policies, and do we believe in evidence-based policy? We do believe, we do share this vision of and philosophy of action, and we believe in strong evidence-based policy, and our role is to inform that. So we really value in those times the value of cooperation, and a cooperation that means that research is guided by our policy and academic partners, implemented jointly, and which can bring meaningful support and insights to change our society. That's what we believed in. It's a long journey. And you mentioned the journey it was. Well, I don't know if the photographs are already yellowish, but our partnership is quite vivid. So, and that's why we like to say that this is a very, rich and dense and very insightful book that the colleague who work on it and will present right after, and I promise not to keep you too long. But this is more a book. This is a partnership this is a materialization of this ambition of partnership. First with African Center of Excellence on Inequality Research, launched in 2018, but with precedent cooperation and collaboration and thinking together. And a partnership with the World Bank as well, in this series, Africa Development Forum, that each year brings novel insights on specific issues important for the development of the continents. Just a few more words. Today's world is characterized by partial, incomplete human development against backdrop of growing inequality and poverty. After a period of decline, human development as measured by the Human Development Index of the UNDP has reached highest level in 2030. But this masks very worrying realities. Unfortunately, well below the level predicted before COVID-19, and the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 10, to reduce inequalities within and between countries, and the first one, to eradicate poverty not elsewhere, will hardly be achieved by 2030. And while global inequalities have been declining prior to COVID, the latter led to the sharpest increase in 3 decades. And these inequalities in the current context of economic, social, climatic, conflict-related polycrisis, as we call them now, threaten not only prospect for economic growth, but social cohesion itself, and the likelihood to improve living condition of our fellow citizens. So, yes. So the discussion we are going to have today, we believe, is going to be crucial in sharing tools and knowledge on how to support truly inclusive, equitable development trajectory that take into account also, and these are novel insights, I believe, constraints imposed by climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and geopolitical uncertainty, and to bring transdisciplinary approach in this work. And I would say, as a conclusion, that the quality and relevance of the research and the dialogue that it's materialized by this book, this collective book, stems from the fact that they are locally driven by institutions such as ACER, such as yours, and with the partnership of all of you here. So this is also why it was very important to have this discussion today here in Africa, after the virtual launch we had in January, to hear your voice from South Africa, Southern Africa, from the continent, and to put that in debate here. So thank you very much for hosting us, hosting the discussion, and I eager to have an insightful and rich discussion on this work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Murray. Thanks, Carl. So our first presentation is by Rawan Yasser, and Rawan is an economist at the FD. She was one of the editors of the book that I had mentioned, and a co-author on several of the chapters. And actually, she is the heart and soul of this book, which would never have gotten finished without her. So, Rawan?
Thank you, Vimal, so much. So, as mentioned in our title, the main objective of our book was to emphasize the multi-layered and multidimensional nature of inequalities and to put this issue on the table. So in the book, we first present an overview of the current situation, but we also identify the key dimensions and challenges of inequalities in sub-Saharan Africa. So these include, first, the challenges to measuring inequalities comprehensively, but it also spans the dimensions of inequalities in education, health, labor market, gender inequalities, spatial inequalities, migration, social mobility, and climate change. And we also propose some solutions that would tackle these inequalities and ensure an equitable and sustainable development in the region. So first, as a general overview, we all know that the African context raises important research and policy gaps in the global discussion because of the specific nature of its inequalities. So first, looking at Africa as a whole, we get a picture of extreme inequality. 7 of the world's most unequal countries are in Africa. And on average, in Africa, the richest 10% receive 54% of total income, while the bottom 50% receive only 9%. So if we look at the evolution of inequality in the recent decades, we see here an African version of Milanovic's global elephant curve that spans Africa's positive growth era. But unlike Milanovic's graph, this one does not have an elephant shape with the substantial bottom end part missing. So what this highlights is that we have an economic growth pattern that has bypassed those who needed it the most, with a top 1% capturing 27% of total growth on the continent. When we look inside the continent, we find very heterogeneous levels of inequality, with Southern Africa having higher levels of inequality, as we can see here on the map. And this is confirmed across other inequality measures, such as the top 10% versus the bottom 40%, for example. But beyond income inequalities, Africa also suffers from the long-run impact of colonialism, which has driven this persistent characteristic of inequalities in the continent and resulted in an intergenerational transmission of land, wealth, education, and health. So these inequalities in education and health, they are not only key aspects of people's well-being, but they are also fundamentally shaping the opportunities for individuals to escape from poverty and actually participate in the labor market, which in turn has important consequences on income inequality. So that's why labor market is the main determinant of inequality and levels of poverty in Africa. The labor markets in the region, they're characterized by a high portion of informal employment, high precariousness, and relatively small formal sectors. So the informal sector in Africa is actually among the largest in the world, estimated at about 85% of total employment on the continent. In the graph, we see that along with South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa has had the highest share of informal employment over the past decade. This informal sector, characterized by lack of protection, high vulnerability, and low productivity, which all amplifies inequalities. But on the other hand, informality can actually be a stepping stone into formal employment, which will partly reduce inequality. So this is why it's crucial to understand this complexity when designing policy actions. In the formal sector, on the other hand, wage inequality in Africa is among the highest in the world. These inequalities are again linked to education and health, and labor market segmentation that occurs across sectors and occupation, but also across population group. For example, women, youth, and marginalized ethnic groups are often the most vulnerable. African women, for example, are more likely to be in self-employment and domestic service, and more likely to be found in elementary occupations. In terms of gender inequalities, in addition to the wages and income inequalities, many gender-based inequalities persist and are deeply rooted in African context and have significant consequences in terms of access to resources and opportunities. One of the important determinants in gender-based inequalities is unpaid care work that makes women's work invisible. In many African countries, women and girls spend more time on unpaid care, which limits their economic opportunities. And this issue intersects with other types of inequalities, such as access to resources. We have about 38% of African women that report owning land, compared to 51% of African men. And this right to property is important, not only because it provides bargaining power inside the household, but it can also offer a means of livelihood for a lot of women. So while the policy attention in terms of gender inequalities is usually given to education and labor market, the other issues of ownership and social sphere are usually harder to address. And this is often because they are the result of gender bias, which is rooted in legal systems, social norms, and institutional structures, which is why policy actions need to take into account this intersectional aspect of gender inequalities and aim to combat social and cultural norms through, for example, legislations, reforms to enhance financial inclusion, and to improve women's inheritance rights. So now, after having seen some of the different dimensions of inequalities we mentioned in the book, we go into what we call in the book pushing the knowledge frontiers, with issues such as climate change, which is one of the most challenging development issue of our time, and especially for Africa, which is the most vulnerable to its consequences. So inequality and distribution are at the center of these discussions related to climate change, because all the recent reports have shown that countries, but also residents within countries, neither contribute to nor are affected by climate change in the same ways. If we look at the map here showing per capita CO2 emissions in 2023, it speaks volumes on the unequal contributions between the global north and the global south. If we look within countries, the inequalities are even greater, especially in terms of carbon inequalities. The high concentration of income in Africa, wealth and carbon-intensive activities in small population groups, they all lead to a significant degree of carbon inequality. In sub-Saharan Africa, the bottom 50% emit 0.5 tons per capita of CO2 each year versus 7.5 tons by the top 10. In terms of impacts, Africa in particular is disproportionately affected by climate change, despite contributing less than 5%. First, low-income countries face significant economic losses and are even poorer today than they would have been in the absence of climate change, to which they have contributed very little. Meanwhile, we have the rich countries who bear the biggest responsibility to climate change that have actually benefited in terms of income. And why is that? Because most countries in sub-Saharan Africa depend more on the sectors that will be affected by exposure to climate events. For example, the average agricultural productivity is estimated to be 35% below its potential value because of drought across the continent, which brings me to my second point. Southern Africa is actually among the regions most affected by extreme weather events, such as droughts, floods, heat waves, that particularly affect rural communities, contributing to famines and loss of livestock. Arid conditions will affect 43% of agricultural land in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to a global average of 29%. And these extreme weather events have a particularly significant consequence for the agriculture sector, which actually impacts food security. And of course, these risks are again affect the world regions differently, with sub-Saharan Africa being the most vulnerable. And once again, because of the dependence on these sectors and the large share of the population that is employed in agriculture, with the share being estimated between 55% to 62%, according to the IPCC. But this is also true at the level of any given country. So within countries, compared to non-poor households, poor households are more exposed to climate change effects like droughts, floods, or heat stresses, and this leads them to poverty traps, especially as many countries in Africa depend on smallholder-based agriculture and thus are more vulnerable, creating this vicious cycle between the impact of climate change and inequality. Poorer households are also less resilient, as their capacity to react and adapt to climate change depends on financial savings and wealth, which they have less of. So all of this shows that we cannot go on with the same patterns and models of work that have been going on. In fact, and now we move to the final key message of the book, that deals with how the patterns of economic growth in Africa have not been sustainable, both socially and environmentally. So first, from a social perspective, economic growth has not been inclusive. Africa has experienced rapid economic growth, but it has not translated to poverty reduction, bypassing those who need it the most, as we said earlier. This is symptomatic from the gains of economic growth not being equally distributed and captured by those at the top of the distribution. At the current rates of income growth and inequality, it's estimated that 55% of African countries are not on track to have the poverty rate between 2015 and 2030. So it means that high inequality is the main culprit behind this issue. For sub-Saharan Africa, findings are especially striking because they find that 1% reduction in the Gini index results in a 30 to 40% variation in projected poverty rates, which highlights the critical role of addressing inequality. Several other key factors also play in this. For example, the high dependence on mining and extractive industries, but also the low responsiveness of employment to economic growth. As we've seen, that Africa actually has a problem of quality of employment rather than an unemployment problem, with high level of informality and vulnerable employment. But this is not to deny the importance of quantity. So what we end up with is economic growth generating low quantities of low quality employment. So finally, going forward, policies for social and economic inclusion are therefore crucial for social sustainability, but also so is rethinking the models of economic growth, particularly in the global north, and moving away from growth-centered approaches to also ensure environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan. Andrew. So next up we have Andrew Dabalan. I don't know if I got that right either. But Andrew is the chief economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. And he's going to talk us through some of the work that they did in the book which they prepared, which has also a policy angle which we're going to get back to right at the end. Yeah? Or in the middle and the end. Thank you, Andrew.
Excellent. So good afternoon. I have 10 minutes to present a book. And I can't have 15. Oh, that's generous. That's right. I can't beat what Rawan just did. But I want to start with some preliminaries. So first of all, it's always a pleasure to be at UCT. This is not my first time to be here. I've come here in the past. I've always really loved it. You have a very beautiful campus, very engaging audiences, and great research. So I want to start with two thanks. One, of course, is with our collaborators from AFD. So when we started our collaboration, we were very, very creative. So what we did was to say, what would be the three letters of the acronym that will not change the IFD at all? So we said, okay, we'll just call it African Development Forum. So we'll just change the letters around so that nobody actually remembers some other acronym, right? So that's how we ended up basically, I mean, jokes aside, I think it's a wonderful, we have 15 years of collaboration this year. We're celebrating 15 years. This presentation that was just made by Rawan, and which is contained in that book, is one of the series. We have over 20 or so already. So if you want to see the kinds of reports that we've put together, I think you should go to either the IFD website or the World Bank website, and you'll be able to see it. We will be leading a series of presentations this year, actually leading with a series of blogs. So that's the first. Second, I want to thank, I'm really, really delighted to be at this center for a center of excellence for research in inequality. At the World Bank, we finance and support a lot of these centers of research in Africa, not just on inequality, but several others. But I'm particularly delighted that we are actually having a conversation about inequality at this center of excellence of research on inequality. So with that, I just want to say 4 things in case I run out of time, okay? The first is that I think we should take inequality much more seriously than we do in Africa. We don't take inequality seriously enough because if we, and the reason why we should take inequality seriously is because it leads to a lot of pathologies, whether that is in economic outcomes, so for example in social mobility, whether that is in the kind of quality of growth you get, or even in social pathologies such as very, very difficult politics, but also very poor social mobility. So that's why we should take inequality seriously. The second point I want to make about why we should take inequality seriously is because inequality in Africa is structural. Okay? It's not because African people don't have ambition. It's not because they don't have preferences. It's not because they don't put in a lot of effort. It's precisely because of things that are inherited. And we shall see that. The third point I want to make is because inequality in Africa is mostly structural, you can't leave it to the market to solve the problem. Okay? You need social policy. Okay? So that's why it's important. The fourth point and the final point I want to make before we move into the presentation is that because inequality is structural and because you need social policy, you cannot also do it only through redistribution. The countries are too poor to actually just do this through redistribution. So what you need instead is a social policy that improves capabilities of individuals, removes distortions, okay, in the market, right, and allow for people to flourish and businesses to flourish. That's the kind of policy that we need. So that is what the book says. Okay? So if I don't get to these points, pick up the book and read it. Okay? All right. So this is basically the outline I was going to lay it out. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to go through all of it. I might just stop at the structural sources of inequality and then wait. So this is the book. It covers sub-Saharan Africa. We actually use both household surveys and enterprises. The reason why we brought in enterprise surveys, because when we think about inequality, we don't usually think about firms and the role that firms play in actually accelerating or accentuating inequality, right? So we thought maybe this is something that we should bring to the table for discussion. Right? But anyway, so this is the location. I don't have a physical copy of the book. Apologies about that. But these days people don't like physical copies of books anyway. So here is the electronic link. Okay. Inequality is very high in Africa, right? So we all know that poverty is very high in Africa. We know this region to be a region of very high poverty, but rarely do we actually talk about Africa in terms of high inequality. Now, people who live in Southern Africa, especially in South Africa where you are, probably are not surprised by high inequality, right? So for obvious reasons, we don't want to get into that now. But the rest of Africa doesn't usually think of themselves as places of high inequality. But here is consumption inequality. This is after you've actually accounted for transfers, subsidies, right? This is what disposable income buys people. And even after all that, okay, you still actually have very high levels of inequality, second only to Latin America, right? So that is the starting point. And you see these levels of inequality across multiple things, right? So you see it in, availability and access to services such as electricity, improved water, improved sanitation, and so on, right? Between the poor and the rich. You see it in social mobility, right? If you're a girl born in 1980, okay, in Africa, you have a 30% chance of exceeding the education of your parents. 30%. That's it. That's half what the other developing countries, a girl born in another developing country outside of Africa actually has. The chances are 60%. And they're parity between boys and girls outside of Africa, right? But there's a big gap between boys and girls in Africa, right? So this is a serious problem, okay? And inequality actually affects the quality of growth and in the efficiency of growth, the way in which growth is converted into poverty reduction, right? Because of these high levels of inequality, a 1% growth in Africa only gets you 1% reduction in poverty, while in other parts of the world, it's twice as large, right? So again, this is where high inequalities actually affect quality of growth and quality of poverty reduction, or even the size and extent of poverty reduction, right? So these are some of the stylized facts that we document in the book. So why? Here's the reason why we think inequality for the most part is structural. More than half of the inequality we observe in consumption is precisely because of inherited characteristics. Where you are born, whether you're born in rural areas or versus urban, whether you're born in one region or the other, to whom you're born, whether you're born to a rich family or not, your ethnicity, okay, your religious background, and so on, right? These are not because people don't have effort or ambition. It's precisely because of these structures of these societies. That's why you get this. More than half, okay? And in some places as much as 74%. One of the obvious sources of increasing one's productivity is energy, right? Modern societies absolutely cannot function without modern and available energy, right? And you can see here these massive inequalities in terms of energy. In fact, South Africa, you're doing very well, except the reliability issues are there. But as you can see, these massive gaps between the poor and the rich, in terms of access to energy. That affects productivity, that affects, opportunities, that affects a whole range of things, right? And these are not, again, things that are up to individuals, right? These are things societies need to provide to individuals in order for them to flourish. There is huge differences in learning outcomes among the rich and the poor, okay? Now, there is nothing that suggests that the distribution of talent or effort or ability among poor kids, kids born to poor families, is any less or different than the distribution of talent or effort or desire that you find in children born to rich families, right? And yet, you can see these massive gaps in learning outcomes. It's just because societies don't provide the kind of quality education, okay, that these poor kids also need in order to be able to actually take advantage of the society's opportunities, right? And then the returns to your capabilities vary grossly depending on which sector you're in, whether you're in agriculture or whether you're in, you work in a wage employment and so on and so on. That's the individual side. So now let's come to the farm side, okay? For farms to thrive, they need to have access to inputs and markets, okay? So there are three markets that really matter for farms and firms, right? This is a very weird English trick, right? Where you have the pronunciation sounds similar, but they're different things, okay? But anyway, so plots of land and businesses, let's put them that way, right? So you need, they need markets, right? They need input markets to work. These are credit markets, land markets, right? Any number of markets you can think about, financial markets and so on, right? Now, if those markets are limited or distorted, right, businesses and farmers will not have access to technology that they need, okay? Or the capital that they need. If the product markets are distorted, there will be very little competition, right? And therefore, you get a lot of inefficiencies. If the labor markets are distorted, okay, there's discrimination, right? Whether because you are a woman and not a man, it's a discrimination because you come from some ethnic group or not, and so on, then again, you can see that the ability to earn productively gets diminished, okay? The reason why this matters is because when you have distortions in labor markets, when you have distortions in credit markets, when you have distortions in all kinds of markets, think about markets, right, in general, any kind of markets you can think about. When you have those kinds of distortions, and there are plenty in Africa, right, there's misallocation of talent. That's the fundamental problem, right? The people who are supposed to run the right businesses that are going to grow, that are going to be productive, that are going to be successful, are not running those businesses. Instead, we have SOEs that are run down to the ground and all kinds of things, right? So that's the problem, right? And look at this. This is one of the clear evidence of what happens when, in fact, you have misallocated talent and when you have broken markets. So these are companies, the size of businesses, right? From the time they start, okay? And then you observe them 16, 20 years later. So the blue is the United States, okay? The yellow and the green are examples from African countries. The first one is Cameroon, the second one is Ghana, the third is Rwanda. And I can take any number, a lot of African countries, and it will be the same story. The African farms stay small. They start small, and they stay small. They never seem to grow. They stay small for far too long, okay? Why? Again, the distortions in the market. They can't find credit. They can't actually find talent, okay? And because of that, there's no job creation. And because there's no job creation, a lot of people, a lot of workers have difficulty finding opportunities in the labor market. And they can't earn the right level of remuneration in order to be able to improve their welfare and their families, right? So that's the problem. And that is a form of inequality. Again, it's structural. It's not because individuals don't have ambition. Individual Africans have a lot of ambition, okay? But they can't find the opportunities they need in order to be able to work. So you have market failures, you have diminished opportunities in doing, for people to acquire product, capabilities and, to build their capabilities, right? And then you have the state systems, fiscal problems that don't actually rectify these problems, right? But they try, right? So to be fair to African countries and African governments, their spending actually reduces inequality, okay? It's just that the starting point for inequality in Africa is much too high. So that even after the reduction, it remains very high. So on the left-hand side, the far left-hand side, is the upper middle income countries, what we in the World Bank classify as upper middle income countries. How much am I doing on time? Okay. Okay, I'll stop after this or the next slide, and then leave the rest of it for later. Anyway, so you can see the upper middle income countries, right? South Africa, Namibia, Mauritius, right? So that's the bar graph, the blue, is the comparison for non-African high-income countries or upper middle income countries, right? You can see that the blue dot or the blue rectangle is market income, okay? And the yellow triangle is the final income that allows these households to purchase education, health, food, whatever, right? After the transfers of tax, you take out the taxes, you add transfers and so on, right? And you can see that in fact, in South Africa or Namibia, the inequality declines substantially after you account for the subsidies and transfers. But it remains still very high. So this is why I said you cannot redistribute your way out of this stuff, okay? It's far too complicated a problem to solve through redistribution. And it's too deep to solve through redistribution. So that's the upper middle income. You can do that for middle income countries, lower middle income countries, the same thing, right? The blue is much, inequality using if you just look at blue rectangles, is much higher. You do the redistribution, it comes down, but it's still lower than the rest of the middle income countries outside of Africa. Same thing with low income countries, right? Wherever you look, it's the same story, right? And then poor people in Africa pay in more in taxes than they receive in cash transfer. Now I have to be very careful here, right? Because this is all about money, right? Or non-in-kind transfers, right? So if you account for education spending, if you account for health spending that is not directly transfers, then this is a very different picture, right? In this case, then in fact, the situation is much better for the poor than. But if you just account for like taxes, subsidies, transfers of all kinds, actually poor people pay in more into taxes than they receive in terms of transfers in Africa. Again, that widens the gap between the rich and the poor, right? And therefore leads to inequality. Final, this is the graph. So on the left is debt levels as of today, right? They have risen substantially. There is a real boom in debt for African countries, as you can see, right? So there is no fiscal space to redistribution. And even if they were to do it, look at this graph on the right, right? This tells you the marginal tax rate, okay? The marginal tax rate on the vertical axis. The marginal tax rate you have to charge the non-poor in order to move all the poor out of the poverty, over the poverty line, okay? Now, the marginal tax rates can be as high as 100%, so this is just not feasible. You know what I mean, right? But even in places like, I don't know, Burkina Faso, Chad, Kenya, it will be 40%. It's extremely onerous, right? It's not affordable. So this is the most important point. So what we really need is we can't redistribute. These countries don't have the fiscal space, and in any case, the tax rates will be extremely high, right? Even if they didn't have the debt problems, right? In order to be able to actually move people out of poverty by redistribution, okay? These countries are too poor, so the only option they have, okay, is to have a social policy that promotes growth and investments in productive capabilities of populations. I'll stop here and happy to discuss the rest of it, which is about the policies.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was fascinating. Okay, we're going to have our panel discussion now. Can the panelists please come forward? Andrew, you have to come back.
Do I need this?
Okay. All right, let me introduce our very distinguished set of panelists. We have, in the order in which I'm going to ask them questions or give them the floor, we have David Française, who is the Deputy Director of the SCIS, which is Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. We have under David, or David, no, from AFD. Anda is an economist who's in charge of research programs on inequality, poverty, and international migration. And she's an old friend of Saldru's. We've been working with her a very long time. I'm guessing more than a decade, no? Yeah? We have Zwanele Mfunwa, sorry, who's the Economic Affairs Officer in the Southern Africa office of UNECA, which UNECA is the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And finally, Andrew, who I won't introduce again. So we've asked them each to prepare some input on how they're thinking about inequality and how they've been doing work and policy work and research as well. And so to bring it into this conversation, but to start with, I'm going to give a question to each of them. Okay, so we're going to start with David. David, it is clear from the presentations that in each African context, asset and wealth inequalities are pervasive and central to understanding the persistence of inequalities. The SCIS has worked extensively on issues of wealth inequality across the global south. So what can we learn from this work and strategies to break these cycles in Africa?
Cool. Thanks, Roman. Thanks for having me. I just have some brief thoughts on that question, and some of them relate to some of the language that we use when we think about inequality and how studying wealth and elites can help us with that. So wealth and elites are really an interesting phenomenon to study in inequality. We knew a lot about income inequality for a long time, and some of this work is showing how those kind of methods have been applied across Africa to standardize our empirical basis of income inequality. We knew quite a lot less about wealth inequality, so we've moved to now understand who are the wealthy, what do they own. And that's where you start to come up, I think, against some of the interesting questions and limits about inequality research. So we can quantify the wealthy, and there's been a whole lot of methodological innovations for that. But that raises a few questions, particularly who are the wealthy and why do they behave the way they do and why do they accumulate? And those are quite difficult questions to ask using quantitative research. And so I think one of the things that studying wealth and elites raises is the role of qualitative research in understanding why and how people behave and how they accumulate. Linked to that is also the role of theory. So the one thing is to describe the world, the other is to try and understand how could it be and how do we understand it, how do we make sense of the data, going beyond describing the way the world looks. And then I think those two link to, we talk about policy, we don't talk necessarily enough about power and politics and how those things relate. And again, elites, I think, are an interesting phenomenon to study in this. The language in the World Bank book, for example, talks about structural determinants of inequality, which is, I think, a really important and useful word. But it does have some sense of a thing that exists with inertia rather than a phenomenon that is produced and reproduced by action that people take on a regular basis. And with elites, again, you start to see this. These are not structural things that just exist and have to be dismantled. They're often actively being built by participants in the policy process themselves. And so, to put those words, power and politics, in when we think about policy, otherwise I think we just go around and around talking about the same thing. And, what role does power have in setting the policy agenda? And the work of Stephen Lukes, I think, can be a little bit useful there. He had the three faces of power, the three dimensions of power, the decision-making power, which is often where we talk about, should we do this policy, should we do that policy? He talks then about non-decision-making power or agenda-setting power, what are which issues at the front of the queue, which are not. And then the third, it's called manipulation or ideological power, which is what's completely off the agenda to discuss anyway. And I think in the policy debates, and if we think about some of the discussions around the South African budget, about where we spend our time debating and what issues are not even considered, they're dismissed out of hand as we cannot do that. There's no, and in some cases there's an evidentiary basis for that. In others, it's an exercise of power about what is on the table to debate in terms of overcoming inequality. So I wanted to just put those on the table for some discussion.
Great, thanks. Well, okay, it's working. So Anda, the AFD has worked very hard within a number of countries to support policies to overcome inequality. Can you share with us how you go about such support and why you, as the AFD, have adopted this approach?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for having us here today. For development cooperation, I have to say that while David was saying that we know a lot about income inequality for a long time, when it comes to development cooperation, it's not that recent, because until the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, as public development banks or development cooperation, we didn't have a mandate to actually work specifically on inequalities, and very often having a foreign country or an institution coming to say, well, your inequalities are too high, let's support you to work on that, was not necessarily very well seen. But with the 2030 agenda and the increasing realization that inequalities are actually a strong barrier in reducing poverty, which is the mandate of development cooperation, we slowly started to go into that. In terms of policies, so we are very lucky to work in many of our partner countries like South Africa on fiscal policies, on social policies, for instance. So we did a fiscal incidence analysis here. We worked with Morocco, for instance, on their fiscal reform. We worked in Senegal with the Ministry of Agriculture around the role that agroecology could play in reducing inequalities. And we have different examples such as these. But coming now over the last year or so, one of the things we also started to realize more and more is that we need to go beyond this social and fiscal approach and trying to understand what should be the policies beyond the classical approach that we could be looking at. So we've been working quite closely with the South African government around the energy transition and inequality specifically, because when transitions such as the just energy transition occur, what happens is a structural change of the economy. And what we've seen when other episodes of structural change have happened is that the structural change can and has very often went into the direction of more unequal outcomes, where a lot of the choices that have been made in terms of industrializing the economies are not necessarily driven by equity concerns, but rather have a very focused approach on pure growth that often is being driven by sectors that are not employment intensive, for instance, and this results in a highly unequal society. So now we've started to look beyond the typical redistributive policies into what are the industrial policies or what are the policy choices that need to be made in when you diversify an economy, for instance, that do have equity concerns. One of the next steps that we're looking at is to also try to look more, for instance, in terms of the choices of infrastructure. Again, going back to the inequality of opportunity, one of the things that that has a strong impact in reducing inequalities will be how do you actually choose where and what type of infrastructure needs to be built, and this is something we know much less for now. And one of maybe a last point is that we realize that as development cooperation, we don't have the tools that allow us to analyze the impact of our operations on inequalities. So whenever we support a country in either setting up a reform or building a bridge or something like that, we don't actually know what the impact of that specific project will be in terms of the distribution of income. So we've been working quite closely with the EU, but not only, in trying to understand how do we actually build a methodology around the impacts, the distributional impact of purely development cooperation projects that goes beyond just inclusion or gender equity as we used to do before. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Sanda. So the next question is from Zwanele. And leaning on the work that UNECA has done on African inequalities, what are the key realities about African inequalities that has come to the fore from the work? And what are the major economic and social policies needed to tackle such inequalities?
Thank you very much. You can hear me, right? Yes, thank you, and thank to the Center for inviting ECA to this August gathering. ECA has been working very hard on inequality. Our office is in Lusaka. It's a sub-regional office of ECA, which is in Addis. And where we are now is the center of inequality. And we have been doing a lot of work since I joined the office. I think it was around 2010. And our work there has been looking at various aspects of what causes this inequality. We looked at economic growth, inequality, and poverty, and we found that actually the growth that we experienced way in the 90s actually did not trickle down. And when we looked at that, we found that actually the nature of our economies do not allow for the employment that was mentioned before. And also is that the extractive industry that dominates is normally foreign owned as well. And the sources of growth in those 90s were fortuitous, basically. It was not because of our industrialization and so forth. It was because the rain was good, so we eat, the rain is gone, we starve. And commodity boom was there. We got lots of money, but that money went out of the continent as well. And then, of course, there were lots of generosity from the donor communities. So all those three were basically fortuitous, not of our own making. And then the other study that we did was on debt, because everybody is always complaining about COVID, this, COVID, that. We decided, okay, let's look now, just prior to the COVID, say 15 to 19, what happened to this ballooning debt that you mentioned. And we found that actually the allocation to education and health actually it went down as a percentage, right? And the non-resource growth actually was stagnant. So we remain reliant on resources. The third one, just in the interest of time, the third one that we worked on was on the status of poverty. And then we look at the multidimensional that my colleague spoke about earlier in the book. So basically, she stole my thunder. But the latest work, the latest work that we are working on now is about the buzzword of the African Continental Free Trade Area, how it can actually reduce inequality through the channels, for example, of promoting, for example, as what do you call them? SMMEs, particularly those that are all owned by women and the youth, and the other channels, of course, of migration and so forth. So these 4 books are available, and if I don't I can give you the copies, online copies. So that has been our work. So the function of the office and of the entire ECA is basically is a think tank, is convening, because we are the UN, convening power that we have of bringing people together, and also to support technically on a limited basis because we don't have the resources. Now, the member states are saying to us, you have been thinking too much. What are you doing on the ground? What is the impact? This is where now we are seeking as much as possible the partnerships, people with deeper pockets, so that we go to countries, individual countries, because the member states and the General Assembly are asking us, tell me as Zambia, what have you done for me lately? And we cannot take these publications and so we did this research for you. It does not help. So that's why now we are looking for partnerships, and then that is one of my remit for being here, to forge as much as possible so that we can work together. We know the truth. There is no mystery in what we are producing and what has been presented there. But we know that the member states are not doing what they are supposed to do. In fact, they are part of the validation team. When we produce a study, we call on all the member states to be part of the validation. So they know what needs to be done, but they go back and forget. So they say, it's money, it's money. So now we are asking for partnerships, and I'm happy, Murray, we discussed this, some of the modalities that we can actually intervene so that we can see concrete results on the ground about what should be done about inequality and poverty. Thanks for now.
Thank you so much. So our last discussant is Andrew again. And Andrew, can you wrap up the panel discussion by revisiting the key policy points that you highlighted and also that have been raised by the other panelists?
Oh, goodness. I'm supposed to summarize the panel discussion?
You're supposed to try.
So look, I think that, David, you're right, that structural inequality sounds, I don't know, this vague terminology that, maybe people in international development use because they don't want to talk about the right things or the correct things, right? So it is about power. I think we should be very clear about that, right? And it's about politics and political power. It's the interplay of political power and interest groups that creates these structures that societies find themselves in. So that can be a problem. It can also be a solution. Okay? Political power does not always lead to paralysis and sclerosis, right? It can be used to actually steer societies away from where they are, right? And I think one of the things that we want to emphasize in these kinds of books is to point out that, in fact, these are choices, right? These are choices elites make, these are choices particular societies make, these are choices that interest groups in a particular societies make. They can make different choices, okay? Different choices that make the government effective, able to deliver, right? And so on and so on, right? So I think if I were to summarize what the panel said, is that when societies find themselves facing these very high levels of inequality, right, the diagnosis obviously is important, right? We don't actually always know what the problem is. I mean, so that's one little disagreement I have with Nzwanele, right? Sometimes we don't actually always know what the problem is, and the policymakers sometimes don't know. Some of them are looking for solutions. So I think these kinds of diagnoses are very important because the process is dynamic, but at the center of that dynamism is what David actually laid out and what under stress, which is power, politics, social choices. And it is possible to overcome African inequality problems if African governments make different choices.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Just stay here. We're going to have about 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So raise your hand and introduce yourself and ask or comment. Yes, sir. Lara, please introduce yourself before you go.
Can hear me? Hi, I'm Zegs van Tonder, the Strategy and Political Research Officer for the Good Party. I just had a question for Andrew. I saw an interesting thing in one of the graphs you put about, you were saying that the effect of 1% growth in sub-Saharan Africa essentially equals 1% reduction in poverty. But then the North African number is like off the charts, like compared to the rest. It's the highest reduction in poverty per 1% growth. Are there, like, obviously you don't have a whole research paper to respond, but are there major key reasons for that? Thanks.
Redistribution. Redistribution in North Africa was extensive, and it's probably, that was the basis for, the glue to the social contract. We will redistribute, even if there are no opportunities in jobs, there are no opportunities in social mobility, and you won't participate in politics. And so it didn't work because it exploded in, what was that? Arab Spring. It was mostly redistribution, and it led to a lot of state bankruptcies. So it wouldn't work, basically.
Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Pascal from Brownie Points. I'm not a clever academic, just a techie trying to make the world a better place. I'm hearing a lot of policy and power and politics, and so a lot of it's just top down. And we work a lot with, the people on the ground and the community-based organizations. What bottom-up forces could encourage or influence or steer the power in politics in the right direction?
Hi, so I was really interested in Andrew's opening on we need to take inequality seriously, and then I was listening to Nzwanele, and I wonder if Nzwanele, if your next publication well, maybe it should start with a footnote and say it's a handbook for politicians, and then the title can be "It's Inequality, Stupid." Because I think this, I mean, the politics around this, that was also, I think, raised by David. I mean, it's about convincing politicians, those in leadership positions, and the elites that drive a lot of the choices that they make, that inequality is bad, and that a less unequal society may even be in their best interest. And I'm just wondering, maybe, I mean, Andrew, if you can get into some of those policy conversations that we'd need to have with the political elite, with those in leadership positions, why a less unequal society is in fact in their best interest. Thanks.
Andrew, part of that was for you and for Anda, I guess. Yeah? Who wants to go first?
Why don't you go? Sure. So 2 points. How do we steer the politicians in the right direction? And I think it's related to, you know, I'll say 3 things about this. So one of my friends, who is a fellow Kenyan at Georgetown University, says to me that there are no good politicians. There are only optimally constrained politicians. Okay? I think what that means is that citizens of these countries need to demand more. Right? They need to be engaged, they need to take politics seriously, and they need to be engaged, and they need to demand more. And I think you can already see that, right? I think complacent African elites are in deep trouble. I mean, I'm willing to say that. And there are a lot of them, okay? And the protests in the summer are basically a preview to what we're likely to see, especially given the fact that the population of this continent is going to double in a generation's time. And it won't take that long before things really come to a head, unless these politicians wake up to the fact that they really need to start making policies that create functional societies. I mean, you see that protests all across. The elections in the most recent years were an indication that people are really dissatisfied. They are very unhappy with the kinds of governance that the continent has. And it could get much more intense if the status quo does not change, right? So I think the best way to make these politicians understand that highly unequal societies where there are no opportunities for their communities, their societies, their citizens to flourish and their businesses to flourish, and not in their best interest, is not because they're going to be very generous. It's because their own survival is going to be in danger. So form interest groups and put a lot of pressure on politicians. That's it.
Anda?
Of course, I fully agree. I think a lot of the discourse around reducing inequality is now turned very much towards how do we actually convince the elite, because we see, I mean, we keep saying that inequality is a policy choice. The fact that we have inequality is the result of policy, so this is what we need to change. It doesn't mean that CSOs, for instance, don't have a role to play, and far from that. I think that we have seen that the mobilization of citizens actually has to come from the bottom, that having people that begin to commit and begin to ask for accountability, it will not come from the top. It has to come from the movements such as the CSOs, because a lot of the demand for redistribution needs to come from a society that feels that is being cared for and that can get together. And without CSOs, without small organizations, that type of mobilization is not possible. So I think there is a strong role to play, specifically in shaping how people need to react to inequality, and they need to demand. What we see is that there's still quite a high tolerance to inequality. I mean, I'm European, so coming to South Africa is always a shock to say, to see how people are still quite complicit of inequality. And a lot of our colleagues and friends who come from Europe, their first reaction is to say, how come things are still this peaceful when there's so much inequality? And you have to ask yourself that. And maybe this type of involvement needs to come from down. But we see that we need actually to also work with the elites and try to see inequality as a systemic risk, because it is what it is, and we're trying to also stir the discussion towards that.
Zanele?
Just a quick one, since Neil asked me to write a book. What is amazing is that whenever we meet with individual, say, heads of states or prime ministers, is that they really know, they have a fair grasp of the seriousness of inequality. And some of the policies that at ECA we are advocating, for example, let me take a simple example of value addition to our natural resources, for example, which, if implemented, could play a part in reducing inequality. And they tell us in private that, look, there is a lot of backlash from those who are benefiting from this. A simple example, we had a one-on-one discussion with Masisi and what they did there in the diamond value chains. And it met with lots of resistance from those outside who are, already rich but continue to be rich. Same thing I noticed when I was in Niger, how the relationship with, for example, France, that if you try to insource all this value addition and beneficiation to our natural resources, there is that backlash. And sometimes it's not in their own interest to push for this agenda. They get out immediately through coups and so forth. So when we are looking at, when I think about this book, but we have to look at also their side of the story. What are the constraints facing them in this agenda of eliminating, inequality using our natural resources in the continent? But can debate.
One more.
Hi, I'm Vaughan Cornell. I'm not an academic nor a politician, but acutely interested in inequality. Very sad it is where it is in my country at this point. It's not really, I can't articulate this question. I work in public health. Well, I used to until Trump came along. But work in public health, and we often look at demographics in all sorts of ways. So you've talked about the demography of Africa and the population. One thing I haven't seen really factored and is going to play into the hell we're going to face is the youth population, often referred to as either a demographic dividend or a ticking time bomb. Well, I think I don't need to tell you this, sir. You're from Kenya. I have colleagues there too. We've seen the ticking time bomb all over. What I'll be interested in, I don't expect an answer here now, but I am actually going to attend a lot of the conference because I'm really interested in where we've got to since towards Carnegie in 2011 that I worked with Française a lot on. I'm just really interested to see how that factors and features, because it's a massive, if you simply look at the percentage of young people that are going to live on this continent, it's extraordinary opportunity, utterly terrifying. So I'll be very interested to see if disaggregated information, but also just addressing that specific issue. I think it raises what you're talking about from the bottom up, but just young people in Africa, as I say, a demographic dividend, a ticking time bomb. So I'll be very, very interested to see what's in your books, but also what comes out in the conversations. Thanks. Not really a question.
Okay, there's another question in the back there.
Hi, my name is Mimi and I'm an economics student at UCT. My question is for all of you at the panel as experts in your field and people who know quite a bit about Africa. What is your take on US aid, and do you think it did enough to actually bridge the gap with inequality, and now that it's potentially being withdrawn, what are your thoughts?
Wow. I'm glad I'm not on the panel. Thank you, that's great. I'm going to let each of you go sequentially and also your final thoughts because we need to wrap up now. So please, the two questions, and then if you want to respond to that, and your final thoughts. Let's start on this side.
Yeah, start on
Zanele?
that side.
If you want to, you don't have to.
Yeah, we were asked in Zambia by the head of the UN, we call them resident coordinators, to look at the US aid withdrawal from Zambia. And we found that actually for many countries, it's going to be huge. And we don't know how the government will be able to close that gap. And when we are debating, we are saying that you are at home, and then your neighbor comes in and say, I will take the role of you feeding your children, right? Is that a right role to be taken over by your neighbor? In our case, for example, if foreigners are taking care of our health, that is so fundamental. Why do we allow that? So there needs to be some kind of prioritization, and we should not rely on handouts for such fundamental things as health and education. Otherwise, we will not go anywhere. So that is, but we did the study, all the fancy things with diplomatic language, and without saying all these things, we say in private that, this is wrong. Reprioritize. The president should not have a convoy of 5 cars from the airport. That money is too much. It can help, on the health issues and education. So, yeah, it's a debate that is ongoing. Thanks.
David?
I don't have an answer to the very good USAID question, but I had a thought based on what Ander said about South Africans' tolerance for inequality. So we care about inequality here, but do we care about inequality? So South Africa has had the highest income inequality for 30 years. It basically hasn't changed, and there have been no political repercussions. So we can say we care about it, but do we? And one of the things is that because it's about a power relationship, maybe it's difficult to link the outcome to the particular causes in terms of mobilizing around an issue. So it's quite hard to mobilize around reducing the Gini coefficients. What do you need to do to get it down? But the other, I think, thinking about some of and the USAID question made me think about other development approaches. Inequality has maybe a more pronounced normative component, and you never see, or I've never seen actual inequality targets. What do we want? So we say 0.66 on a Gini coefficient is bad, but what would we be happy with? Is it a kind of rate of change from 0.66 to 0.6 or downwards? Do we say 0.4? Do we have and I don't think there's been much work in saying where do we actually want to go. So I don't really know where that leaves us, but I think that maybe some honesty about who cares about inequality, of what, for who, and do we have the ambition or the courage to set some targets about where we think we might want to intervene and how it should look when we end up there.
Thanks, David. Anda?
It's fascinating because we're having exactly the same questions, and this is why it's so difficult to say that we're going to reduce inequalities, because you can't have a normative approach to it. It's not like poverty where you want to have zero poverty. Inequalities, I don't think anyone would say we don't want to have any type of inequality, because it's not possible. But it's difficult to say starting from which actually level you consider. I know that the World Bank has done some work on that, so I'd be very happy to listen to Andrew. But just to react very briefly, I think on youth, you're perfectly right. You will have some of the figures in our book. Unfortunately, we didn't receive the copies in time, so we can't advertise them, but it's online. And one of the issues that we haven't dealt enough in the book is around intergenerational equality, especially with regards to climate change, because youth will be bearing a big part of the climate change impacts, and this is quite often overlooked, especially in development cooperation. The question of depth also, it's quite important for that. So indeed, I think it's an interesting point that we need to make more prominent. On USAID, I wouldn't necessarily go into the impacts on inequality because honestly, I don't know enough. What we see beyond the pure impacts, which are tragic on the ground, is also the signal it sends in terms of where international solidarity and cooperation is going. So we hope that some of us will stand their ground and we will manage to continue to work together as partners. I'm not sure that we have the capacities to bridge the gap that was left by the US aid funding because constraints and fiscal constraints are present everywhere. But at least maybe bridge the signal that was sent by the US in terms of what we aim as a sort of common future when it comes to cooperation. Over to Andrew.
So on youth in Africa, so we worry a lot about the youth in Africa for good reason. It can be a really, really this single transformative factor in Africa. This is the first time in recorded memory that this continent will be a center of population. It's been mostly an empty continent, basically, very sparsely populated. And usually when you have these large increases in population, you have basically historically two things that happen. Either there is massive outmigration, that's what happened in Europe in the 15, 16, whatever centuries, or you have massive transformation domestically. That is economically, politically, socially, you name it, culturally. The African countries don't have opportunity for outmigration. Okay, so it's going to have to be domestic transformation. And to do that, you have to invest in people, right? So you really have to invest in the health, education, the infrastructure that people need, the energy, the power, that kind of stuff, in order to be able to increase the productivity of the population you have and the factors you have. So that there is no choice about that, and that can be incredibly alluring. And this is happening when all the other regions of the world are actually having a demographic, decline, right? So there is some opportunities for migration, but not much. It's the domestic transformation that is. So that is the way we think about it. We've written a report about this that is about to come. I think we are actually likely to come and launch it here in South Africa in the next month or two, depending on the politics in the World Bank and how they navigate the US. Because somehow you can't talk about migration anymore, but that's a different matter. So we intend to actually come and talk to African countries, but also some European countries that are interested, because there are opportunities for that. And so I think we've taken very, very serious analytic approach to this work, and we're very hopeful that in fact it's going to be the transformation. On USAID, so this is something we monitor, all right? One of our roles in the Chief Economist Office is to monitor, things like GDP, inflation, debt, but also aid cuts and things like that. So what we find are two things. One is that it's going to affect mostly two sectors in the region. One is health, and the other one is humanitarian. Okay? So a lot of people who are in camps, who are displaced, who are refugees, rely a lot on the UN systems, but the UN systems are funded mostly by these aid organizations such as USAID. So that, unfortunately, what that means is a lot of vulnerable people already will suffer. But we don't expect it to have massive impact on the broader economy, because a lot of the USAID has been delivered mostly to, except perhaps in health, where a lot of pain and suffering will. But that brings me to this question. So what Nzwanele said, which is, it's really not a good idea to be too aid dependent. It's a bad thing. Okay, I know a lot of people are going to suffer because of what has happened, especially people who are already on, really life-saving medication, people who are already like on rations in displaced populations. And so it's hard to talk about, being aid independent when there's a lot of suffering that's going to take place. But the fact that these countries put themselves in this position itself is really unacceptable. Okay? I don't think, and this is partly why you should not outsource. Okay? This is not an original idea. I mean, so this has been talked about. You should not, as a country, outsource spending of some core expenditures to other people. Things like security, health, food security, education. These are really important things for your society to be self-reliant and independent and autonomous. You can't let the financing of those things to foreigners. I think it's just a bad idea. It's bad form. I hope that African policymakers will take note that this is the beginning of an end to those kinds of dependencies. So, and I just want to say one last thing about David. So you're right. You can't really mobilize around reducing Gini from 0.5 to, I don't know, 0.4. But you don't need to. You can mobilize around, let every child have equal opportunities and education. You can mobilize around, let everybody have some quality housing. Or you can mobilize around, we should have universal health care. These are the indicators that resonate with people, that people experience as a form of inequality. And you can mobilize around those, surely, right? And then after that, inequality, the Gini will come down anyway. So that's how we should approach this, the politics of inequality.
Okay, thank you. Let's give them a hand. So actually, it turns out that someone else has this venue from 6 p.m. And we're late, but we have some closing remarks from Audrey. So if you could be really quick. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm Audrey, the director of AFD in Johannesburg. Sorry, do you hear me now? Yeah. So I thank you all for your participation and for the discussion. As you all said, a more equal world is not a dream. It's about politics, it's about choices, and in the end, it's a decision. That's what I heard today. And every policy we shape today is a step toward that reality. So I would like to thank you very much all today, as you are helping us to build the evidence we need in shaping more equitable policies. And we need more equitable policies because more equitable societies are more prone to prosper and are more resilient to shocks. And actually, this is important because we are today in a situation of shocks. We are in a situation of climate emergency. And I mean, all of this implies environmental, social, and economic crisis. We are already in it, and it disproportionately harms vulnerable populations. When we see that wealthier groups often have the resources to adapt or to relocate. Just a little word to say that South Africa, of course, is one of the more highest unequal Gini coefficient, but it's one of the countries that set up ambitious objectives in terms of achieving a just transition pathways, which is equally sensitive to environmental and social concerns. And as AFD, we are proud to be able to partner with you on this journey. Starting with tomorrow, we are going to have the South Africa at 30 Years of Democracy conference, and we will be able to go deeper into this conversation. We will be discussing the major developments of the last 30 years, but more importantly, the next priorities. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion tomorrow. I thank you all very much. I thank our partners at UCT for all the work we have done together, the trust and your commitment to our joint project over the last 10 years, you said? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. This is the last closing remarks from me. We want to say thank you all for attending, and to Andrew and Rawan for their presentations. To all of our panelists, thank you. David and Zanele and Anda. And you know, on behalf of Acer now, it's so nice to have these types of events where we got lots of people who are working on similar things, and we're sharing and we're working together, and we can collaborate and we can partner, and we really appreciate that, and we look forward to carrying on these interactions going forward. So now there's a cocktail party on the second floor.